Good day and welcome to the Critical Focus channel. So we're now finally going to review the rest of the card pool from the Harrowdeep Box set. I already put out a review, probably a month ago at least, with the Grand Alliance cards, and now I'm getting around to review all the regular Universal cards. So I actually started reviewing the objective cards, and then I just felt staggered by the amount of cards left to review, and life went on. I did battle reports, but now we're gonna do it. Bear with us, here it comes. And first up is Contest of Equals. Search scores immediately after a failed attack action if the attack roll and the defense roll contain the same number of successes, including critical successes. Yeah, I've played this several times. It works almost every time. And yeah, it works both for your attacks and the opponent's attacks, which Brandishing Fate, which is a similar card, as well does. But rolling 3 defense die isn't something you do very often, so it's technically just for your own attacks. This can be scored from round 1. So yeah, I'm gonna rate this an A. It's includable in every deck. In Cold Blood, Search Duel scores immediately after a friendly fighter's attack action that takes the target out of action, and that friendly fighter has no wound counters, or that friendly fighter is an assassin. So at the moment we don't really have any assassins in the game unless you upgrade them, or I'm not sure, maybe there's a ploy, but no one really starts as an assassin at the moment. So, and having no wounds when you kill someone, yeah, sure, it can happen if you'll meet a lot of plebs, but if you're meeting an elite team, it's gonna be pretty hard. So I think it's too hard for a search objective, and I'm gonna stick with the lowest grade here. I'm gonna give this an E. Next up is Reckless Swing. Search scores immediately after an activation step in which a friendly fighter made a range 1 attack action that targeted a fighter with more supporting fighters than the attacker. Yeah, so you don't have to succeed with the attack, you just make an attack with bad odds basically, which is a weird thing to do. I think it's okay to include if you are planning on doing scything attacks anyway. Otherwise I probably wouldn't take this card, because it feels like a bit of a trap to rush in, potentially overextending a fighter just to score a search card, making an attack with low chances of succeeding. I wouldn't take it in that specific scenario. And it's very matchup dependent. If you're meeting an elite warband, it might be pretty hard to set up, and if you draw it too late, it might not be able to be scored at all. So I'm not a huge fan. I mean, there are definitely harder objectives to score, but on the fence between a C or a D here. I'm gonna stick with a D. Next up is Unequal Contest. Search, score this immediately after a friendly fighter successful attack action if the attack roll contained only successes, including critical successes. So this is a little bit weaker. I think it's mainly tailored towards really accurate fighters, or fighters having a very easy time getting supports. For example, Cunning Crew getting full supports is really easy, and several fighters there actually hit with hammers. So yeah, getting full supports with hammers is very likely to land you only successes. But if you play this on, I mean, like something like Grashrax with a lot of 2-sword fighters or whatever, it's not going to be really playable. Of course, you cannot always be lucky, but I think it's mainly for really accurate fighters. It's perfect for something like Majoris, which have a built-in potential reroll for attacks with the Aether Quartz counter. Yeah, Canaans will also be really strong with this one. Lots of fighters with hammers and an easy time to get supports. So yeah, for certain teams it's really strong, but generally it's slightly weaker than Contest of Equals, so I'll rate this a B. Still very good card. Alright, next up is Competent Conjurer. Scores an NFS if in the previous phase your warband cast a number of spells greater than the number of wizards in your warband, including out-of-action fighters. So spell attacks is counted as spells, but the keyword here is cast, so if you don't succeed, it's not cast. So just making spell attacks and just trying to cast spells isn't gonna cut it. So I think this card is way too hard to score, and you're banking on having eligible targets for spell attacks or drawing enough gambit spells, and no, it's definitely not worth it for 1 glory. This is an E. Alright, next up is Fallen Titan. Scores in an end phase if one or more enemy fighters with a wound characteristic higher than each surviving friendly fighter's wounds characteristic is out of action. So it's kind of banking on that you don't wounds upgrade any of your fighters. But it's certainly playable for Gods One Hunt, it's certainly playable for Gits, it's certainly playable for Majoris, but for anyone else it's unplayable. It's a C for the teams mentioned, otherwise it's gonna be at the low end. So yeah, C/E. Fearless Seekers. Scores in an end phase if 2 or more friendly fights are on feature tokens in enemy territory. So this is a stronger version of Treasure Hunter basically. It doesn't require objective, so you don't have to flip and potentially lose the defensive bonus for the first activation of the next round. But it's also 1 less glory. But I think it's very playable for any warband with at least 4 fighters with decent move. So from there on up, I think it's a solid B. Just include a couple of push cards, which you probably will do anyway. So yeah, and it requires you to actually want to be fairly aggressive. So yeah, aggressive warbands with 4 fighters with decent move. It's a solid B. Alright, next up is Inseparable. Duel. Scores in an end phase if 2 or more friendly fighters each have 1 or more charge tokens and those fighters are adjacent. So we're getting a theme here with cards that requires you basically to go last, because if you charge with 2 fighters and they are adjacent and the opponent have 1 more activations, can you really guarantee that those fighters still are adjacent? I doubt it. So yeah, it also requires you to go last or be charging with fighters with range possibly. I'm really not a fan of this card. Just 1 glory as well, so it's not reliable enough for 1 glory. This is another E. Alright, next up is Lead from the Front. Scores in an end phase if your leader is the only friendly fighter in enemy territory. It's easily enough to set up, I guess. I could see Mollog do this, but just for 1 glory and having no synergy with cards like Bold Deeds, unless all your other fighters are dead. No synergy with cards like Dominant Display, unless all your fighters except the leader is dead. And no synergy with Fearless Seekers. So I think it's fine and easy enough in of itself, but since it lacks synergy, I don't like it. I'm gonna give it an E, just for the lack of synergy. But I would love to be proven wrong, so please comment if you think otherwise. Next up is Lead from the Rear. Duel. Scores in an end phase if your leader is the friendly fighter furthest from each enemy fighter, and 1 or more friendly fighters are in enemy territory or in a no one's territory. So yeah, obviously tailored towards teams that raise fighters, and you kind of want to protect the boss, like Scritch, Sepulchral Guard, Grimwatch. So might seem like a good idea initially. The second part is certainly very easy, but the first part might actually be a bit tricky because you have to be furthest from each enemy fighter. I think that kind of decides it for me, that it's not guaranteeable enough to play. And it also kind of leans into what I said for the last card, that it requires you to go last in the round to make sure your leader actually is the furthest away from each enemy fighter. And playing objectives that kind of requires you, possibly not requiring, but kind of is assisted by you going last, I don't think that's a great idea. So I'm gonna give this a E actually. Okay, next up is Looming Threat. Scores in an end phase if 2 or more friendly fights are adjacent to the same enemy fighter. Yeah, if you don't have the last activation in the round, it's gonna be pretty hard, and you might not always want to go last, especially not in the second or third round. So I think this objective kind of goes against your interest a bit, and it's really never guaranteeable enough to be played, I think, for 1 glory. So I'm gonna give this a, it's not unscorable, but it's fairly weak, and especially for 1 glory, I'm gonna give this a D. Next up is Lost in Shadow. Duel. Scores in an end phase if your warband holds 2 or more objectives and 1 or more enemy fighters are in cover hex. So yeah, holding 2 objectives isn't that hard. Your opponent having a fighter in cover hex probably will happen. You can't guarantee that they won't flip them up though. So if they're not standing in the specific gloom, which cannot be flipped, yeah, I'm kind of dubious about this card. And if you kind of push them in there, it's going to be super suspicious as well, so they might flip. Yeah, and in the best of 3, it's going to be really telegraphed when you play this. So I'm not a huge fan of this. It's certainly scoreable out of just pure circumstance. So I'm gonna give it this relatively weak C. Alright, moving on. Next up is Out for the Count. Hybrid scores in an end phase if each surviving enemy fighter is staggered or 3 or more enemy fighters are staggered. This seems really hard. Staggering each enemy fighter. I mean, just reaching each enemy fighter can be hard, so how are you banking on staggering each of them? If you're meeting a really defensive team with a leader staying way out of sight, no, this seems really hard to do. This is gonna be E. Alright, next up is Risky Strategy. Scores in an end phase if 1 or more vulnerable friendly fighters each have 3 or more upgrades. 2 glory. So if I were to try to score this objective, I'd probably play something like Gits and take a board with some lethal hexes on to just double up on running through lethal hex, staying alive with 1 wound, I guess, because otherwise ensuring that you're vulnerable with 3 upgrades is pretty hard. And in the first round it's going to be hard to get 3 upgrades out. So I mean, first of all, you actually need to draw three upgrades or use one of your activations to draw upgrades, even if you have the glory. So I think it's way too hard banking on being vulnerable with 3 upgrades. No, it's a crazy card and it's definitely not a good card, so it's going to be an E. Alright, next up is Cyan of Shadow. Duel scores in an end phase if 1 or more inspired friendly wizards are each in a cover hex, and there are 1 or more illusion upgrades in your power discard pile. So the second part is easy enough with a new reshuffle rule. So if you have enough illusion upgrades, drawing one of them in 10 cards is probably not that hard. The first part can be tricky for multiple wizard teams like the Vamps, especially with a new Inspire step. If you play official rules, you don't inspire until the subsequent Inspire window, so you won't be inspired in the end phase. Yeah, so it's not scoreable in the first end phase for them. And for someone like Wartimis, guaranteeing that he will inspire, yeah, you can't really do that because he has to succeed with his range 3 attack. It's gonna be pretty hard. I think this is playable for like Godsworn Hunt. Getting Thedra inspired with an upgrade is very easy. On the other hand, guaranteeing that she is actually alive is a bit harder. So who else? Yeah, potentially Kanan, but guaranteeing inspire in the first round is not that easy because they need 3 Tith. And that's not going to be a guarantee in the first round. So I think end phase cards that have troubles being scored in the first round is a no-go for me. I'm going to give this a E. Alright, next up is Sinking Feeling. Scores in an end phase if there are more friendly fighters on feature tokens than there are enemy fighters on feature tokens. So basically the Harrowdeep version of Dominant Position, and slightly more reliable since it's only feature tokens and not objectives. Still just 1 glory though, so I'm not sure about it. You need at least 6 fighters to play it probably, or a lot of push cards, which you probably would take anyway if you plan on being objective or feature token focused. So I think it's fine. It's not great, but it's, yeah, I think it deserves a C. Alright, moving over to the Ploys. First up is Audacious Move, +2 move to friendly fighters in the next activation step, except when making a charge action. I think this is extremely strong for a couple of warbands, Gits and Canans, but mainly Canans, I think, can really make the Mortic Advance super powerful, and actually lets you trigger that move to a fighter that normally is too far away. So if the first fighter charging is way ahead of the other Mortics, the subsequent moves can actually reach him, making you able to assist or getting onto tokens or whatever you want to do. So I think for Canans, especially, Gits generally, and for other warbands probably won't see play. So I would say A for Canans, B for Gits, and E for everyone else. Why make it easy? Alright, next up is Brave Companion. It's a reaction. Play this during an attack action after the declare attack action step. If a friendly fighter is the target, push another friendly fighter up to 2 hexes so that they are supporting the target. If that other friendly fighter is a companion and the target is named on their fighter card, instead push the companion by the shortest route so that the companion is supporting the target. Okay. So if I'm reading this right, if it's a companion, you can push him unlimited amount of hexes, I guess. But let's just ignore that part. So the first part, play this during an attack action after the declare attack action step if a friendly fighter is a target. So when you are attacked, basically, you can push another friendly fighter up to 2 hexes so they are the supporting target. So it's a weaker version of counter charge with a twist. But you don't have to be charged, actually. So it's stronger in that regard, but weaker in the regard of how many hexes you can push. This is not that bad, actually. Especially if you have stuff like Impending Doom in your deck, I guess. I think pushes are always worth to consider. And since this does not require you to be charged, I think it's just easier to get off than counter charge. And especially if you have such objectives that are scored by either like Impending Doom or also like type you need to make X amount of reactions, which several warbands have, like Seraphon, the Savage Orcs, the new Stormcast, probably, yeah, Illusory, I guess, if anyone is still playing them. So I think this is pretty fine. It's not an A, but it's, I think, could certainly be worthy of a B. Okay. Call of Fate. Alright, reaction. Play this after your leader is dealt damage. That would take them out of action before the out of action check. Roll 1 defense dice. If you roll a crit, remove wound counters from your leader until they are vulnerable. So they will stay alive with 1 wound if you roll a crit. So the good part of this card is that you can play this not only from attacks, but any damage that would take you out of action. But the rest of it is horrendous. Relying on a single crit, and you still will just stay alive with 1 wound. No, don't include this card. It's horrible, and you don't need me to tell you that. The clearest E in the bunch. Next up is Elite Advance. Choose 1 friendly fighter in enemy territory, or up to 2 friendly hunters in enemy territory. Give each chosen fighter 1 guard token. So I guess if you have offensive hunter warbands, like the Vamps, possibly 2 guard tokens isn't too shabby, but generally speaking, it's not that powerful with guard. The amount of cleave and snare in the game right now, you will hinder the push, I guess, but otherwise it's not that great of a deal. Certainly not a terrible card, but I just generally think guard token cards is pretty boring. But that aside, it's not worthy of the lowest grade, but I'm gonna give it a D. Alright, moving on. Illusory Transference. Reaction. Play this after a gambit, which shows 1 or more friendly fighter is resolved. If 1 or more illusion upgrades were broken as a result, pick 1 of those broken illusion upgrades and give it to a friendly fighter not chosen by that gambit. No, this seems extremely circumstantial and only works when a actual gambit breaks the card, which in most cases won't happen. So, no. I mean, I guess the upside is that the gambit breaking the illusion can also be played by yourself. So if you have an illusion on a fighter and you sidestep him, you can transfer the illusion upgrade to another fighter. But I mean, it's still very circumstantial and it's still not good. So I'll still give this an E. Alright. Live for the fight. The first attack action made in the next activation step has +1 dice. If that attack action is made by Brawler, each attack action made by that fighter in that activation step has +1 dice instead. So yeah, it's not the most fun design, I guess. +1 dice is still very solid, and it works for any range, which can score you Branching Fate, for example. And if you have a Brawler, like the Hammer guy in the new Stormcast team, it's +1 dice for each attack. Yeah, it works well with Reckless Swing. This is solid. It's B, sure. It's not most fun card, and I probably won't include it most of the time, but I still think it's a very solid choice, and you can't go wrong with an extra dice. So it's a B. Next up is Not Lost. Choose 1 friendly fighter. Then scatter fire from that fighter's hex. If the chain enters one or more empty hexes that contains a feature token, place the chosen fighter in one of those hexes. Otherwise, nothing happens. Yeah, it's not that hard to accomplish, but it still has the element of randomness that's not so desirable, I guess. And although the potential is really strong that you can push fairly far, but that's just the best case scenario, so I think just standard pushes are better, like Heated Instinct, Sidestep, Center of Attention. Anything really that's more reliable will just end up higher on the pecking order than this one, so I don't think this will see much play. It's not the most terrible card, but it's still not worthy of anything more than D. Penumbral Falls, which is a waypoint card. I think it's the first waypoint card we see, so which makes it a bit hard to gauge the power of it, I guess. At the end of the action phase, deal 1 damage to each fighter that is in edge hex. This effect persists until another waypoint is played. So it's kind of like a cycle ploy thing. Persisting Gambit. So, I mean, if you want to score stuff off persisting gambits, or if there will be objectives that score off waypoint cards, I guess. But at the moment, seems extremely circumstantial and not desirable. It actually damages your own fighters as well, if they are in edge checks, which kind of forces your hand, I guess. So, no, I won't play this at the moment, so it's just gonna be an E. Next up is Rising Waters, -2 from each fighter's move characteristic to a minimum of 1 in the next activation step. There have been a couple of this type of cards, and if you play it, the opponent will just do something else that doesn't really require them to move, or the effect will be very minor. It's just for 1 activation. I mean, you have a very limited amount of ploys, and I mean, I think ploys are kind of the hardest ones to choose because there are so many good ploys that your initial selection will probably be somewhere like 20 cards that you have to narrow down to 10, and this won't be one of them, so this is going to be another E. Shadow Lure. Choose 1 friendly fighter, pick 1, push that fighter 1 hex towards the nearest cover hex, or pick the nearest feature token in an empty hex and move that token 1 hex towards that fighter. Okay, so you can push a fighter 1 hex towards the nearest cover hex. So you don't have to push onto the cover hex, you have to push towards the nearest cover hex. So that's very versatile, actually. The second part is pick the nearest feature token in an empty hex and move that token 1 hex towards that fighter. So this is, it's not exactly the same, but it's kind of like a stronger Symbiote's Call. I think this is a great card and have so many different applications, really. And you will always be able to play it sometime during the game. So it's not matchup dependent, it doesn't force your hand, and you can just use it to manipulate the game in so many different ways. So I think this is a great card. I will give this an A. Alright, Sikkim. Choose 1 friendly fighter. Push that fighter 1 hex towards nearest enemy fighter, or up to 2 hexes towards the nearest enemy fighter if the chosen fighter is a beast. So it's a kind of a limited push because you have to push towards the nearest fighter, the nearest enemy fighter, not just any fighter. And that just narrows it down too much, I think. I mean, Heated Instinct Sidestep will always come up stronger than this one. I mean, the extra added benefit for being a beast, I don't think that's great. I mean, beasts die very easily, so even if you have 2 or 3 beasts in your team, that fact alone won't make this card worth it. I mean, a push is a push, and if you need more of them, maybe you will want to include it, I guess. Especially if you have fighters with range 2 or 3, it's pretty decent. But it's not the strongest of the bunch when it comes to push cards. But sure, I'll be kind and give this one a C. Too close. Reaction after an attack action that targets a friendly fighter. Give that fighter 1 guard token. If that fighter is vulnerable, heal 1 that fighter. So if you are vulnerable, you will be taken up to 2 wounds instead of 1. So, wow. The first part, I mean, You can just give out guard tokens with regular ploys that don't require specific reactions, unless you want to score reaction type search objectives. But I mean, there are so many good reaction type ploys, so why include this one? This is a E. Right, next up is Unfair Fight. Reaction. Play this during a friendly fighter's attack action after the declare attack action step. If that friendly fighter has one or more supporting fighters, stagger the target. That attack action has Grievous until it has been resolved. So the stagger actually occurs before the roll attack dice step here, so you get a reroll for free. And if you have an innate reroll from another source, this will be a great card to score Branching Fate. It will also be a great card to score Unequal Contest. And the Grievous part is just icing on the cake to deal extra damage on a crit. And it doesn't have a range increment as well, so it's a pretty versatile card and one of the better reactions in this core set. I'm not really sure here. I'm leaning between an A and a B. I mean, ploys are super hard to gauge because there are so many great ones, and they really compete for a very narrow card pool here. But I really like this card because of all the reasons mentioned. So maybe I'm too lenient here, but I'm gonna stick with the A here. Just gonna add the caveat here that 3 or less fighter warbands won't play this, obviously, but yeah, kinda goes without saying. So next up is Whetted Blades. Pick one. You can re-roll one attack dice in the attack roll for the first range 1 or range 2 attack action in the next activation step, or that attack action has cleave. In either case, if an assassin makes the attack action, that attack action also has Grievous. Re-roll one dice is never going to be as strong as an extra dice, unless you stack re-rolls to score Branching Fate or something like that, or Unequal Contest. So, specific circumstance, but kind of relies that you have 2 ploys at the same time, unless you have it from another source, or that attack action has cleave. I think if it was 1 reroll plus cleave, I still don't think it would be super powerful. I think it's too weak of a card to make the limited card pool. No. It's not terrible, but it's not more than a C. Last one of the ploys is a very interesting one, actually. Withering Shadows. Pick one, flip one feature token in an empty hex, or roll 1 attack dice for each fighter in a cover hex, and on a roll of hammer, deal 1 damage to that fighter. So we'll just ignore the second part, relying on hammers to deal 1 damage. No. First part is very interesting though. Flip 1 feature token in an empty hex. So, yes, let's just ponder how the meta looks right now. We have like every card, every deck including Coveted Spoils, Wasteland, stuff like that. And even worse are the Infestations and the Hold the City, which is kind of really abusive of the way the meta is going right now. This card is a really strong anti-meta card. To flip 1 feature token in an empty hex, so one that a fighter is not standing on, basically. To just, there's an objective, no one is standing on that one. So unless the opponent has a counter to that card, maybe the same card, you can really shut down those 5 glory end phases, or potentially even more. So I think it's really worth considering. So I'm just going to judge it from the standpoint of the current meta, which I guess that's how you should always review cards, I guess. But at the current meta, so yeah, at the current meta, I think this should probably really considered. So I'm gonna rate this A. Okay, let's embark on the upgrade card journey, I guess. We start off with the Blunt Force Master. This fighter's range 1 and range 2 attack actions that target an adjacent fighter have stagger. Reaction after this fighter's successful range 1 or range 2 attack action, push the target 1 hex away from this fighter. I think this is kind of a weird card. So the stagger, I don't think stagger is super powerful. There are a couple of cards that give stagger before the attack, but stagger as a effect on a attack actually doesn't give the target any drawbacks until after a successful attack action. So after the attack action, they will have a stagger token, which they can just remove by guarding them. So it's not that powerful. So I don't think it's worth an upgrade slot. So let's look at the second part here, the reaction. After this fighter's successful range 1, range 2 attack action, push the target 1 hex away from this fighter. It's just for range 1, range 2, and usually if you want to hit stuff, you don't want to push them away. I guess it works on guarded fighters as well, though, because it's not a drive back, it's a push, but it's still fairly situational. So I wouldn't rate this card. I mean, we'll surely see worse cards, but I'm gonna stick with a D here. Alright, next up is a pretty weird card, Cagey Fighter reaction. So you have to pay for the upgrade and then be able to use the reaction afterwards. So once you have this upgrade paid for and in place on the fighter, you can use it in the following way. After this fighter's activation, in which they made 1 or more failed range 1 or range 2 attack actions, scatter 2 from this fighter's hex and push this fighter along the chain to the end hex. If the chain is interrupted, or if this fighter would be pushed into a hex that is blocked or occupied, do not push them any further. If no, I mean, we have Soundless Step. We have Soundless Step and we have Duelist Speed that just is very similar, but more reliable in the way you push. So if you scatter 2, one of those symbols you get will probably not be desirable. And if you have Soundless Step, you can just push in whatever direction you want. And both eat up the same reaction window with Soundless Step and Duelist Speed, not requiring you to fail a range 1, range 2 attack action. So I fail to see why you would ever take this one. So this is just not great. This is an E. Alright, next up is Dark Insight. While this fighter is in a cover hex, they can make the following action. Action, look at the top card of your objective deck, pick one, draw that card and discard one objective card, or put that card on the bottom of your objective deck. So you have to pay for this upgrade, spend the glory, and then you have to stand in a cover hex. So you can't move out of a cover hex if you want to use this action. And the action is to draw a power card and then discard another objective card, or the same one, I guess. Or you can put that card that you draw on the bottom. I mean, if this were available before the new reshuffle rule, where the chance to have undesirable objective hands were much bigger, this would probably have slightly higher power than it has now. As it stands, this is not good enough to use up a action. You have just 12 actions or 12 activations in an entire game of Warhammer Underworlds, and using an action to potentially do something that's not going to be of any use at all, and forcing the fighter to be in a cover hex to be able to do it, and spending the glory to get the card out, no, this is not good enough, and this will be given the lowest grade of an E for me. Alright, next up is Heroic End. Give this only to a vulnerable fighter. +1 move, +1 defense, +1 damage to this fighter's range 1 attack actions. This fighter cannot be healed. When this fighter is taken out of action, break this card. So they have made sure it's not abusable in the way that it can't be fully healed up and all those super stats. But mostly they have made sure it's not playable on a raceable fighter. So when you're taking out action, you have to break the card, so you can't keep it and then go back to full health with after being raised. But they've also made sure that it's not a playable card at all, because you won't really bank on being vulnerable with a fighter just to give it this upgrade. I mean, and +1 move and +1 defense isn't that big of a deal, and the damage is only to range 1 attack actions. So it's very situational and not as great at it as it might seem. So this is another E. Alright, next up is Master of Shadows. This fighter is a hunter. You can re-roll 1 dice in this fighter's attack rolls while this fighter is in a cover hex. I think this is great for ranged warbands. For warbands with at least 2 or more ranged fighters, something like Thundrix, Fast Riders, or Storm of Celestis. Just easier for them to get in cover and still having eligible targets. For melee focus warbands, there's better choices for accuracy cards than this one. So a B for those warbands, and not super crappy, but a D for anyone else. Alright, next up is Penumbral Dirk. Attack action, this fighter is a hunter. 1 range, 3 swords, 2 damage. If the target has 1 or more upgrades, this attack action has cleave. Cleave, not that great. a reroll is probably better. You want to fish for crits, so something like the Soul Tooth Dagger better, or yeah, several Soul Tooth weapons actually, and the Silent Sword is also better. So yeah, I wouldn't include this one. It's not extremely crappy, but it's not good enough for a weapon upgrade. You will never include more than 3 or 4 in Swarm type warbands, and this will probably not make the cut, so yeah, I'm gonna stick with a D here. Alright, next up is Phantom Fathomer, attack action, 1 range, 1 smash, 2 damage with Grievous. This attack action has +1 dice for each upgrade the target has. Very cool card design, I think. So very weak in the first round and potentially extremely powerful in later rounds. I like this kind of dynamic design. It's not stale, it can really swing either way. It has big swing and a miss potential, but also big swing and a hit potential. So I would probably try to include this. It's not reliable in a competitive deck, but it still has some real potential in specific scenarios. So yeah, I would probably give this a C, just to say middle of the road with this one, because I'm kind of dubious how I would rate it, but certainly better than Lost Card. Yeah, so I'm gonna stick with a C here. Next up is Pilfered Prize. Give this only to a fighter with a wound characteristic of 2 or less on an objective token. Put that token on this card when this fighter is taken out of action. First, place the objective token on this card in the same hex as this fighter, unless that hex is a lethal hex, a cover hex, or a hex that contains another feature token. Then break this card. Sure, you can score like Arms of the Everwinter with it, but you can only put it on the 2 wounds fighters. It's only 2 of those in that warband. And by the time you get this upgrade on your hand, they might be dead. Sure, Gits can probably use it as well, making infestation slightly easier. But yeah, paying for an upgrade to remove objective tokens seems fishy and very circumstantial. I'm just gonna give this an E. Alright, next up is Searing Ink, reaction after a successful attack action that targeted this fighter. If the attacker is adjacent, deal 1 damage to that fighter and give that fighter 1 charge token. Then break this card. So you can do 1 ping damage 1 time and then the card goes away. And you have to pay 1 glory to give 1 damage 1 time and potentially a charge token. And it's super telegraphed. No, this is one of the most horrible cards I've ever seen. This is an E. Next card is Shade Mark. If this fighter's defense characteristic is dodge, you can re-roll 1 dice in this fighter's defense rolls. Not super powerful in and of itself, but if you stack it with Champion's Fortitude and potentially something like Horrific Armor, it can be quite tanky on someone like, let's say, Snurk Sourtang. I mean, re-rolling defense is not too shabby. It's not the most fun card design, but still a solid card. It's a C. Alright, next up is Terrifying Shadow, an illusion upgrade. Do not spend any glory points, etc. So, -1 dice from attack actions, while this fighter is in a cover hex, to a minimum of 1. +1 defense if this fighter is in a cover hex and is a minion. So the minion part, let's just disregard that, because most fighters aren't minions. So what we have to work with here is -1 dice from any range attack actions that target this fighter while the fighter is in a cover hex. So it's an illusion upgrade, super unreliable, might just go away in the same power phase that you play it in if you're chosen or damaged by a gambit, or dealt damage in any way, shape or form. So yeah, I mean, as far as illusion upgrades, they are really hard to gauge. I mean, probably more objectives will be scored out of illusion upgrades, but I don't really see this being played. It's certainly a strong effect as long as it lasts, so I can't really give it super low grade here, but I'm gonna stick with a D for this one. Alright, getting close to the end here, so I'm gonna keep it short and snappy. Unfazed, +1 defense while 2 or more enemy fighters are adjacent. +1 defense if 1 or more enemy fighters are adjacent if you are a brawler. So the first effect is super crappy, relying on 2 enemy being adjacent to you to have +1 defense. No, never in my life. The second effect, 1 or more enemy fighters to get 1 extra defense. I mean, as soon as they move out from your range and attack you from range 2 or range 3, it has 0 effect. No, this is one of the worst cards of the bunch. This is an E. Second to last, we have Waterlogged Map. It's restricted to leaders. If this fighter is in enemy territory at the end of the third action phase, gain 1 glory point. It seems too weak to see play. I mean, you only cash in the third end phase. 1 extra glory. Sure, it's certainly very doable for Rothkorn or Molog or any big brute, but you compete for a very limited card pool here. 10 upgrades, and this is not one of them. This is an E. And we have finally reached the end with a weapon upgrade, Withering Blade. You cannot give this card to a leader. This fighter is an assassin. And the attack profile is as follows: 1 range, 3 swords, 2 damage with stagger. So as I've mentioned earlier, I don't think stagger is that great, because the effect only applies after the attack. Having rerolls up front is just much better than stagger. So I don't think this is good enough, just because there are better choices. You have the silent sword, you have the sword tooth dagger, etc. So I think this is too weak. This is not horrible, so I'm gonna be kind here in my last review and give this a D. Alright people, that is the complete review of every card in the Harrowdeep box set. Quite the task, but I feel really good for finally getting to the end of them. And I think it's really interesting to sit down, take your time, twist and turn with every card and see if you can find use for cards that you've initially discarded, basically. And yeah, some of the cards I've kind of changed opinion on after reviewing them like this, so certainly an eye-opener there. So if you have any questions or you want to discuss a particular card, feel free to comment below. And don't forget to subscribe, follow, like if you enjoy our content. So until next time, take care and bye.